Before I start the video, I just want to mention real quick here that TCG Player is giving you 8% back on all the purchases that you do for the next couple days. I believe it goes through Thursday of this week. Pretty crazy stuff. If you're trying to buy a bunch of cards right now for new format things and you want to buy some cards later, you'll get 8% of all your purchases right back. Make sure if you want to do that to use my link in the description below, because a portion of those sales goes right back into the channel. So a lot of the talk on YCS Niagara, which happened this past weekend, is on the first place deck list, because if you guys were paying attention, a Gren Maju deck actually managed to get first place, and while this might seem like something you can just dismiss as a fluke, it's not quite that easy, and the reason is pretty simple, because it's not just one random rogue deck accidentally getting a win. If you look back to YCS Portland just a few weeks ago, the same strategy, or at least a similar strategy, managed to get second place. In today's video, I want to talk about Gren Maju as a card and sort of a little bit of its history, but I also want to focus on the differences between the two duelist finishing deck lists. And I want to focus on that because while some players might just look at it as, okay, both decks are going second, Gren Maju decks are trying to OTK their opponent, they must be very similar, and while it is easy to go into it with that sort of idea, in reality it's not really the case, because these decks actually don't have a ton of similarities. Less than 50% of the main extra and side is actually the exact same, and actually in the side deck especially, you see almost an entirely different side deck out of both deck lists. So in today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about Gren Maju, as well as the differences between these two top finishing deck lists, because they are very interesting to look at. If you don't know, Gren Maju is a level 3 fire monster that gains 400 attack and defense points for every single banished card, and this does count both you and your opponent, and it does count face up and face down cards. Now I think for most of this card's history, it's been just sort of a meme. I mean, when Pot of Desires came out, people were like, oh, it's broken. I think I even played Gren Maju in like a random deck playing Pot of Desires in the past when it first came out, but in general this card hasn't been very competitive. Eventually we saw some stun decks see a little bit of success with this card. Basically they played this card alongside Eater of Millions and Pot of Desires and Inspector Border and Thunder King and a bunch of traps and spell cards like Moon Mirror Shield. And while those decks were cool, and I think a lot of people wanted them to be better, they just weren't consistent enough and they weren't very good at breaking boards. That's ironic because the current reason that you want to play either of these variants of Gren Maju is because they just blind go second and break every board your opponent can make. So while the original, or I guess original version of Gren Maju is more of a controlling stun deck, you really have to keep in mind when we're looking at these two new decks that came out, the second place version from Portland and the first place variant from YCS Niagara Falls. These decks are trying to go second, break the board, and then just OTK their opponent on the first or second turn. So a very different style of play than the original versions we saw a few years ago. But when we compare the cards that are actually in both deck lists, you can see here it's not a ton of them. You have about half of the main deck, you only have 3 cards in the side deck that were similar in both topping lists, and then you have about half the extra deck. So not a lot of similarities here, and we can see the very core essence of the Gren Maju deck, and that's what these cards are. So obviously you have 3 copies of Gren Maju, you have 3 copies of Gizmek Orochi. This is by far, I think both players would agree, the most important new piece of this strategy. I mean, we had Gren Maju for a while, we had Pot of Desires for a while, we had Eater of Millions for a while, and while those cards were good in the original Gren Maju decks a couple years ago, this is the new card that really pushes the entire strategy together. And when you look at these lists, you'll notice between both of them, when we look at them in a second here, that they have a lot of level 8 monsters and a bunch of rank 8s in their extra deck, and this is one of the biggest reasons why. So what this card does is it repeatedly summons itself for free. Well, I say free, but you have to banish the top 8 cards of your deck face down, and not only does that give you a free body on the board, it's also a level 8 monster which you can overlay with. It also has 2450 attacks, you can attack with it. Then also obviously it sort of helps out that Gren Maju get to even higher attack points, although you don't really need it to get that crazy, you just need it at that like 8,000 point or 10,000 point, so that you can attack over like one monster just for all 8,000 damage with one attack. This thing though I think makes a huge difference, because if you look at those earlier builds of the deck, it really did rely on drawing the Gren Maju, but as both duelists have claimed in their deck profiles, you don't actually have to draw the Gren Maju to win. And they say, I think both of them said the exact same thing, that about half the duels they didn't actually see this card and they were still managed to OTK their opponent. And that really does go to show how good this card is. We obviously see this card in the Orcus deck as well, which is worth mentioning. The other similarities here, the danger monsters both played dangers, but the only dangers that were overlapping here are 3 copies of Bigfoot and 3 copies of Thunderbird. This makes a lot of sense. These cards are very strong. They help put big bodies on the board while also breaking the board. They both have discarding effects that pop cards on the opposing field. You'll see the second duels to play this deck actually play a lot more danger dangers, really heavily going into that danger engine, but we'll look at that in a second. 3 Pot of Desires seems really standard. 3 Super Poly seems very standard for this deck. You have not only can you use your opponent's dark monsters to use Super Poly, but we've seen both duelists in feature matches actually use their own dark monsters to just put extra damage on the board with Super Poly. You can even do some crazy stuff, like if you have 4 darks or 3 darks on the field, you can Super Poly 2 of them, make Starving Venom, attack directly, and then use another Super Poly to make another Starving Venom, hit your opponent for even more damage. 2 copies of Trade-In were similar in both these builds as well, and then 1 copy of Monster Reborn. Monster Reborn being very, very important for bringing back that Gren Maju and just pushing for extra damage. As for the side decks, you see both players taking a very different approach, and it makes a lot of sense because for the Portland second place version, Nibiru was not out, so the format, even though it was technically under the same ban list, it was a sort of a different format. Those Megatons changed a lot, so you see the second place version playing a lot of different cards because they don't have access to Nibiru. Then the first place version really did heavily rely on that Nibiru interaction as well as some other cards for going first because the format was a little bit different. As far as the extra deck goes, it's everything you'd probably expect here. We have some really solid rank 8 monsters, we have a bunch of Nightmares, and we have the 2 most common Super Poly targets played in both lists. But what I want to show you guys here as we go and look at the actual lists themselves is that both players found very different ways to break their opponent's boards and go for those OTKs. For example, this is the second place list. This was from YCS Portland, and the big engine here, I mean, there certainly are other differences, but the big engine here is this Golden Castle engine, and for a good reason. It does have a lot of internal synergy with the Gren Maju cards. It banishes cards from your deck, and it gives you like more cards to throw into back row. That's the big difference between the two lists, is that the second list here, the first, well, it's the second Gren Maju list, but the first place list that we'll look at in a second, that one deals with monster cards a lot more, and this one really deals with back row a lot more. We can see that in the side deck as well. So what these cards do is they just throw free monsters on the board and they pop back row. So this one blows up an opposing back row. This one can blow up any card really, but a lot of times it's used for back row and then it can attack twice. And then we see some cards like Call by the Grave that wasn't in the other deck list. We can probably guess at you don't want to get Ash Blossom on like the Pot of Desires or the Golden Castle or anything along those lines, because this does special summon a guy from your deck. We also see Eater of Millions. So this is not in the recent first place list. It was only in the second place list from Portland. That's kind of an interesting choice. I don't know exactly the reasoning between not playing this card. It is just another body you can throw out there. It's another piece of removal, another piece of a way to actually get that Gren Maju up to higher amounts of attack points. We even saw in the feature matches used with this card, you can banish like 14 of the cards in your extra deck and get that Gren Maju to huge amounts of attack and defense. Pretty crazy there. As far as the extra deck goes, the biggest difference between the 2 extra decks are the Galaxy Eyes package, which if you watch the profile from the Niagara Falls first place winner, he talks about why he didn't include this in his deck, and it does make sense. I mean, it's probably fine. We also see an extra Super Poly target in Mud Dragon of the Swamp. The side decks here are really interesting because what you see in this one is almost entirely for back row decks. We both have Twin Twisters in both those decks. We also have the Cosmic Cyclones, the Eradicator, really, really strong cards. We see Gamma in there for going second in combo decks. Keep in mind, there's no Nibiru at this point, so combo decks are a lot more prevalent. You have to play against like Thunder Dragon, Guard Dragon strategies and stuff like that. And then for the going first thing, not only do we have the Eradicators, we also have There Can Be Only One. So this player was sort of opting to play a Floodgate if they went first, not some of the cards that you'll see in the other lists. This is the first list, sort of like the, I don't want to say like the standard list, but at the time when this thing topped and it got second place, it was a pretty big deal, and a lot of people got a lot of awesome ideas from this strategy. But then we go one step further, and this list is significantly different, and the main difference here is that instead of that Golden Castle engine, I mean, it's entirely cut. All of those cards are completely scrapped, and most of them are replaced with danger monsters. So this looks very similar, at least to me, when you take out the Gren Maju cards, to sort of like Danger FTK, at least sort of operating on a similar line of you can go second and just break your opponent's board and OTK them, because Danger FTK, very deadly deck going first, but a lot of times going second, you could just OTK your opponent using the regular danger monsters and not the Cannon Soldier FTK. But what's really crazy here is how dedicated this first place list was to the level 8 danger monsters. Not only are there 3 copies of Bigfoot and Thunderbird, but also 3 copies of Danger Ogopogo. This card proved to be pretty useful, but also he played Danger Response Team, the spell card. This deck is very clearly designed to break through more monster heavy boards, and that's one of the cards that can do that, because it bounces a danger back to your hand and then an opposing monster back to their hand. Then also in the graveyard it has a cool little cycle effect as well. And then also the biggest difference for me as far as how these players approach the back row decks was Hey Trunade. So if you watch the profile from his first place list, he said something really interesting. He said that against Striker he would oftentimes just not really play any cards, because a Striker deck, if you don't play any cards, probably isn't going to be able to OTK you. So if Striker made him go first, he said in his profile, he would basically just pass for a few turns until he drew this Hey Trunade. And really keep in mind here that with 3 copies of Hey Trunade, how many ways he has to get to this card, because yes, he can hard draw it, but he also has the 3 Pot of Desires, he has the 2 trade-ins, he has a bunch of deck thinning from all the danger monsters. He has a lot of ways to get to that 1 copy of Hey Trunade that he needs to break apart his opponent's entire field. And once he used Hey Trunade on his opponent's back row, like the 3 Widow Anchors and the 1 Shark Cannon they probably have set, now he's just free to OTK his opponent. He has so many big monsters available, and that really does lead to a very easy win against a popular deck like Sky Strikers. But when we look in the side deck, we see even more crazy things going on. We have Danger Zone, and we have Shared Ride, cards that he said he would side going first against Striker because it would make him go first. He'd set either 1 or 2 of these cards, and then he just sort of sit on those because the Striker opponent isn't going to OTK him. Obviously, Nibiru is a card that you can draw into with either Shared Ride or the Danger Zone going first. I just like this list a lot. I mean, this really does take advantage heavily of that Nibiru, which is a new card that the older list didn't have access to, and we can see here how this deck is changing a lot. By not playing the Golden Castle cards, yes, you're a little worse off against back row strategies, but you are a lot better off against the monster heavy decks. You don't have to play as many specific cards for dealing with things like Thunder Dragons, because that deck just isn't as popular as it was back in Portland. The basis of both of these decks is that you just don't care what your opponent does, because while it is true that at least for Portland, you were still playing against Thunder Guard Dragons, they're making pretty crazy boards. As far as right now, and as far as Niagara Falls, the boards people are making aren't that scary. A lot of them just have like 1 negate, maybe even 2 negates at most. You're not dealing with those 5 negation boards, those 4 negation boards, and that's really what this deck capitalizes on, because there's too many cards to actually interact with. And a lot of times what I've seen from people playing this deck, what they do is they just are able to 1-for-1 trade through all of your opponent's cards and then just lock down the game with a normal summon of a Gren Maju as their final card in their hand, and that is extremely powerful and extremely difficult to deal with. You also have a ton of survivability, not only with the Gizmek, but in this list you have the Danger Zone as well, because you can draw into cards. This card is actually, I mean, it's Graceful Charity in the form of a trap card, but it can discard any of the danger monsters to trigger all their effects. Pretty broken stuff there. So I really like the Gren Maju strategy. I think it's a really cool rogue deck. Is it ever capable of being a meta strategy? I mean, probably not. I mean, the problem with a deck like this is that if it ever became too popular, people start side decking against it, and I think it really falls apart. But as a rogue strategy, I think even after taking a 2nd place followed up by a 1st place, I think people still are going to be sleeping on this deck. But if you are going to a regional qualifier over the next couple weeks, if you're going to YCS Dallas, you want to be able to make sure that maybe you don't play cards specifically for this matchup, but you have something that can actually beat this deck, or at the very least, you know how this deck operates, so you don't just get caught dead in the water because you aren't sure what your opponent is actually doing. Once you play this deck a few times or play against it a few times, you'll have better knowledge that you need to actually deal with it at a real tournament. So make sure if you're going to an event in the next couple weeks to actually get a couple games in against Gren Maju decks, either one of them, just to see how it operates. Anyway though, I think that's all for today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's deck profile discussion video. I mean, I wanted to look at these 2 deck lists because I felt like a lot of people weren't actually comparing and contrasting them. If you'd like to purchase any of the cards that I mentioned, as I mentioned at the beginning, make sure to use my link, tease2player.com. There is that's in the description below, and I think through today there is an 8% cash back deal. Pretty cool stuff. So you get 8% back for future purchases that you can make, which is really awesome if you're trying to save some money while also buying those cards. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.